I came here to disappear. After 20 years of arguing laws I didn't believe in, I just wanted quiet, salt air, wood, and water. But peace doesn't always mean safety, and that old cabin had other plans for me. When I pulled up to the property that morning, the tires of my old Ford F-150 crunched over oyster shells and gravel like broken glass. The air smelled of salt and sun-baked seaweed. Ahead of me stretched 200 feet of forgotten coastline, wild, wind-beaten, and beautiful in its defiance. Marsh grass leaned toward the bay like tired soldiers. The remains of a dock jutted out into the gray water, tilted, splintered, and stubbornly still standing. And there, half swallowed by vines and time, sat the fishing shack. Weather-blackened boards, windows clouded with salt. It leaned just enough to show it had survived every storm since Roosevelt was president. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air wrapped around me, heavy and clean. For a long minute I just stood there, breathing it in. I was 39 years old, recently divorced, and a former maritime attorney, a man who used to spend his days arguing over water rights and his nights trying to remember why any of it mattered. I'd spent 2 decades defending corporations that treated coastlines like balance sheets, arguing about riparian lines, liability clauses, and insurance loopholes that made even truth negotiable. Eventually, something in me cracked. Maybe it was the sound of another settlement that protected no one. Maybe it was the moment I caught myself saying a line I didn't believe, within the limits of jurisdiction. That's when I realized I didn't want to live inside limits anymore. So I quit, sold the condo, took what was left of my pride, and bought this piece of land at a county auction. $28,000. One blurred photograph, a deed dated 1943. That deed, God bless the man who wrote it, included riparian rights to the water line, legal access, old law, still binding. It was my favorite kind of clause, simple, honest, and older than every HOA in the state. I remember running my fingers along the paper when it arrived, thinking, this right here, this is what law used to mean. A promise, not a weapon. The breeze picked up, carrying the faint hiss of waves against the pier's bones. I could almost hear the ghosts of fishermen from 80 years ago laughing at me, a lawyer trying to play carpenter. Yeah, I muttered, looking at the shack. Laugh it up. The boards creaked as I walked up the sand path. I pressed a palm against the doorframe. Rough, sun-baked pine, solid in places, rotted in others. But it felt honest. Real wood, not polished courtroom oak. It was perfect. Not because it was pretty, but because it was mine. Inside, the air smelled like salt, dust, and old stories. A single crab trap hung from a nail, rusted shut. An enamel mug sat on a shelf, fossilized with salt. Someone's initials, E.L., were carved into the wall beside the window. I touched them like a prayer. Outside, the tide rolled in. The gulls argued overhead. I thought about the years I'd spent in conference rooms with no windows, watching men twist the truth like it was a piece of rope. I thought about how tired I was of pretending that winning meant something. This place was supposed to be my truce, a chance to rebuild something small, something quiet. No clients, no judges, no battles, just time, wood, and water. But I've learned one thing about peace. It attracts the kind of people who want to own it. Back then, I didn't know about the manicured development half a mile up the shore, didn't know about the pastel houses, the private beach signs, or the woman who believed she owned the ocean. All I knew was the sound of the waves and the feeling of finally exhaling without apology. If I'd known what was coming, maybe I'd have turned the truck around right there. But truth is, I wouldn't have. Because that shack, that stretch of wild coastline, it didn't just give me a home. It gave me a reason to fight again. And that, I suppose, is where all this started. It didn't take long for peace to start cracking. The first knock didn't come from the wind or the waves. It came from a deputy's cruiser. It was a Tuesday morning, warm and still, the kind of morning that made you believe the world could mind its own business. My crew had just started ripping the porch off the shack, 2 hammers, 1 radio, and the smell of cedar dust in the air. Then I heard gravel crunching. I turned and saw the cruiser easing down the sand track like a shark nosing into shallow water. The driver's window slid down, slow and deliberate. Behind it, a woman stepped out of a white Lexus SUV. White linen pants, oversized sunglasses, gold bangles that caught the sunlight like bait. Her expression said authority, but her eyes said control. "I'm Karen Levelville," she announced, before the deputy could open his mouth. President of the Coastal Vista Shores Homeowners Association. The way she said it, you'd think she was governor. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked up slowly. Morning. The deputy nodded, already looking like he wished he were somewhere else. Sir, he said, we got a call about possible unpermitted construction on community-adjacent property. That phrase, community-adjacent, was bureaucratic art. It meant, we don't own it, but we wish we did. I raised an eyebrow. Adjacent, huh? That's what they said. He shrugged, helpless. Karen folded her arms, her perfume sharp in the sea breeze. This land borders our private beach, she said. Your equipment and noise are disturbing our residents. You're to cease all activity immediately. Her tone had that HOA rhythm, half demand, half condescension, wrapped in the word policy. I felt the lawyer in me twitch, the old instincts that never really die. So I reached into my bag and handed the deputy a folder. Recorded deed, boundary maps, and the original 1943 riparian rights agreement, I said. Still valid under federal public trust doctrine. He thumbed through the papers, eyes narrowing with the slow relief of a man realizing he'd been dragged into someone else's nonsense. Karen glanced at the documents like they were forged monopoly money. That agreement is ancient, she said, waving one manicured hand. This community beach was established in 2012. It's private property. Our residents pay maintenance fees for its upkeep. I smiled. Then they've been paying for sand they don't own. She blinked, offended by the calm. Her jaw tightened. Sir, your construction is infringing on our peaceful enjoyment. Peaceful enjoyment. The phrase hit my ears like a courtroom echo. I'd heard CEOs use it to shut down fishermen, neighbors, and small towns that couldn't afford lawyers. And now it was aimed at me. I looked at the deputy. You'll see in there, I said, tapping the folder. This parcel predates Coastal Vista Shores by about 60 years. It's not under their jurisdiction. The beach beyond the mean high tide line is public by federal law. The HOA can't fence it, claim it, or charge rent for the ocean. The deputy nodded. I'll take this back to the office and confirm. In the meantime, there's no reason to shut down your work if everything checks out. Karen's lips pressed into a thin white line. You'll regret this, she said quietly. But not to me, to the air, to the idea of being challenged. Then she turned on her heel and marched back to her Lexus, muttering something about calling the county environmental board. The deputy gave me a small shrug, that universal good luck with that gesture, and drove off. As her SUV disappeared up the dune road, one of my guys whistled. Nice neighborhood you picked. I laughed under my breath. Yeah, real welcoming. But something inside me shifted. Not fear, just a sense of déjà vu. I'd spent half my life fighting people who thought rules were weapons. I'd sworn I'd never do it again. Yet here I was, standing on the sand with a deed in my hand, realizing I was about to. The tide was coming in. Waves rolled against the old pilings like a slow drumbeat. I looked out at the water and said, mostly to myself, you want to fight over the shoreline? Fine, but this time, the law's on my side. The gulls screamed overhead as if they already knew. Peace wasn't going to last long. The deputy's taillights disappeared up the road, swallowed by heat and distance. For a long while, all I heard was the ocean. Steady, indifferent, honest. The kind of sound you could build a life around. My crew went back to work, but the rhythm had changed. Every hammer strike felt louder, every motor hum more exposed. That's what happens after someone brings law into the picture. It turns sound into evidence. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just another overreaching neighbor with too much time and too little sense. But something about the way she'd said, "You'll regret this," stayed with me. Not a threat exactly. More like a promise from someone who never heard the word no in her life. By sundown, the worksite quieted. The crew packed up, engines fading down the highway. I stayed behind, sitting on the tailgate of my truck with a thermos of coffee gone cold. The bay was calm, the light turning the water the color of tarnished brass. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt watched. I caught movement up along the dunes, just a flicker, a reflection, like glass catching the last light. Maybe binoculars, maybe just imagination. Still, I raised my phone and took a slow photo of the horizon. Old habits die hard. In my world, you don't win by fighting, you win by documenting. I went inside the shack and sat for a while, listening to the wood creak and settle around me. The place smelled like salt and rain, and for the first time, I realized how fragile it all was. This piece I thought I'd bought for 28 grand and a signature. I used to think the worst battles happened in courtrooms, but at least in court, everyone knew they were fighting. Out here, the war came quietly, wrapped in polite smiles, paper notices, and neighborly concern. Somewhere across the bay, a dog barked. Then silence again, long enough to feel heavy. I stood, checked the door latch, and looked through the cracked window toward the HOA side of the shore. Rows of pastel homes glowed in the dusk, perfect as a postcard. Their streetlights flickered on one by one, tiny watchtowers marking a border I hadn't meant to cross. I whispered to no one, "You wanted quiet, James. Now listen close. It's never really quiet, not when power wants something." Outside, the tide rose another inch, brushing the edge of the old pier. A gull screamed once, sharp and distant, before vanishing into the fog. That night, I left the porch light burning, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted them to see it from across the dunes, and know I was still here. 3 days passed, long enough for the sea to change moods and for me to start believing maybe Karen Levelvell had found a new target. Then, Friday morning, I walked down to the site and found a sheet of paper taped to the backhoe. The wind tugged at the corners. The county seal stared back at me like a warning label. Stop work notice. All construction suspended pending investigation of environmental impact. That was it. No signature, no attached report, just the sterile authority of a government font. I'd seen enough of those in my life to know exactly what it meant. Someone had friends in the right inboxes. I pulled it off the machine and turned it over in my hands. The ink had bled slightly from the sea air, but the message was clear. No work, no progress, no peace. I walked around the site, feeling the breeze whip through the grass. The guys were already whispering. Nate, my foreman, looked uneasy. "You think that's real?" "Real enough to scare good men," I said. We gathered by the trucks. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but I could see it in their eyes. They'd worked long enough around beach communities to recognize the pattern. HOA calls the county calls the inspector calls the pause. It's a quiet chain of command where nothing gets proven, but everything gets stopped. I told them to pack up for the day. "We'll sort it out Monday," I said. They nodded, polite but distant, the way folks look at someone who just caught a bad kind of luck. By noon, I was alone again. The machine sat silent, yellow metal fading against the dunes. The stop work notice flapped on the seat of my truck like a white flag nailed to a corpse. I poured a cup of coffee and sat behind the wheel, staring at the water. The tide was coming in. So was the fight. You see, I used to draft these things, back when I was still wearing suits and billing hours for clients who thought the coastline was a chessboard. I knew the language, vague, polite, but lethal. Pending further review, possible impact, community concern. They never had to prove damage, just whisper it loud enough, and the system did the rest. And now, here it was, biting me with the same teeth I'd once sharpened. That night, I got an email from an old contact in the county clerk's office. Subject line, "Heads up." Inside was a copy of a citizen complaint filed by one Save Our Shores Coalition, an organization I'd never heard of. The attached statement accused me of reckless coastal development and potential destruction of fragile wetland habitat. No evidence, no survey, just a paragraph of moral theater. The name at the bottom, Karen Levelvell, founder and interim director. I almost laughed. The woman had formed a nonprofit in 72 hours. A fake environmental group, probably with a logo, a Facebook page, and a P.O. box that matched her HOA. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. She wasn't trying to win legally. She was trying to choke me with red tape. And I had to admit, it was clever. When you've fought a few wars in courtrooms, you learn that there are two kinds of opponents, the loud ones and the patient ones. Karen was the patient kind, the kind who poisons the well while you're still drinking from it. By Saturday, I couldn't get a single return call from the Environmental Oversight Office. Every permit I'd already pre-cleared was suddenly under further review. Emails bounced between departments like raindrops on tin. She was leaning on the system, and the system was leaning on me. Sunday night, I drove out to the property just to clear my head. The tide was high, brushing against the ruined dock. The air smelled like wet cedar and diesel. I stood there, the stop-work notice still folded in my pocket, and listened to the surf pounding against the shore. I wasn't angry yet, just tired. Tired of the way power dressed itself in virtue. Tired of watching people like Karen twist the word law until it looked like a fence post. I thought about walking away, selling the lot, cutting my losses. Then I remembered the man who had built this shack in 1943, some fisherman with more hope than money, carving a life out of salt and wind. That man didn't quit, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let a committee of neighbors erase him with a stapled form. So I drove home, pulled the deed from my desk, and laid it next to my old bar card, the one I swore I'd never use again. They looked at each other like two old friends who'd fought and forgotten why. I poured a drink, leaned back, and whispered, "All right, Karen, you want a legal war? You picked the wrong retired lawyer." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere off the coast, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel tired. I felt ready. By Monday morning, the air around the site felt different. Still the same salt, the same sea breeze, but with something heavy mixed in. It's strange how silence can feel hostile when you know someone's behind it. The first phone call came from the concrete supplier. "Sorry, James," he said, his voice awkward and small. "We're, gonna have to postpone your delivery. Got some issues with zoning paperwork." He didn't sound like a man with zoning problems. He sounded like a man who'd been visited. Then came the lumberyard. They couldn't guarantee supply. The framing crew texted to say their insurance rep had warned them off the project. By Wednesday, half my team had walked. Not angry, just spooked. You can't blame them. In small coastal towns, reputation spreads faster than a cold front, and nothing kills business faster than an HOA whisper campaign. I kept working, but the sound of hammers was gone. Only the wind and the gulls and the echo of my own boots crunching through sand. That afternoon, a new face showed up. Said his name was Ricky, claimed he was a fill-in from one of the day labor crews I'd called for backup. He had big shoulders, quiet eyes, and the kind of politeness that felt rehearsed. "Morning," he said. "Heard you needed help cleaning up around the dock." "Yeah," I told him, handing him a rake. "Nothing fancy. Just watch your step near the pilings. They're half rotted." He nodded, started working. Seemed fine at first, but after an hour he started asking questions. Too many. "You gonna rebuild that dock wider? You sure you're clear on the setback line? What kind of permits you running on this job?" The kind of questions people ask when they're not really there to help. That evening, as I locked up the trailer, I caught a flash of reflection. His phone raised just enough for the lens to glint in the light. He lowered it fast, muttered something about checking the time. I didn't say a word. Just smiled, offered him a cup of coffee, and invited him inside the trailer for a break. Inside, the air smelled like sawdust and diesel. He sat down at the folding table. I poured 2 cups, asked about his work. He said he'd done paving for a company I knew. I asked who owned it. He gave me the wrong name. That was all I needed. He left soon after. What he didn't know was that 2 days earlier, I'd wired a motion sensor recorder under the shelf and a camera in the corner. Call it instinct or paranoia. Later that night, I played the footage. There he was, phone to his ear, voice low. "Yeah, I got a clear shot of the erosion near the base. I'll send it over." A pause. Then, "No, he doesn't suspect anything. I'll try to get into the permit box tomorrow." And then the line that made my blood go cold. 500 now, another 5 if I can delay the inspection. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. I sat there in the dark, listening to the hum of the generator, feeling that old courtroom calm rise up in me, the same calm I used to get right before cross-examination. This wasn't about property lines anymore. This was about sabotage. The next morning, I fired him. No argument, just told him not to come back. He tried to act confused, but he knew. I posted new signs around the fence line. Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. And this time, I meant it, but the damage was already spreading. A local gossip board popped up online. Out-of-towner builds illegal dock. Someone posted a photo of my backhoe, cropped to make it look like I was dumping waste into the marsh. I recognized the angle, Ricky's camera. By the end of the week, I couldn't go into town without getting side-eyed. The same people who had waved at me 2 weeks ago now crossed the street when I passed. Karen didn't have to win in court. she was winning in whispers. I spent that weekend at the shack, mostly alone, fixed the porch, checked my cameras, watched headlights come and go from the HOA road after midnight. I didn't call the sheriff, not yet. I wanted more than a report. I wanted proof. Funny thing about being a lawyer, you stop believing people, but you never stop believing evidence. That Sunday, I sat at the small table in the trailer, recording my notes like I used to for case prep. Voice steady, no emotion, just facts. Date, time, observation. I was building a record, brick by brick, for the storm I knew was coming. Outside, the wind was rising. A piece of plywood banged against the wall, sharp and hollow. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt since my courtroom days. Focus. Karen wanted to isolate me. She didn't understand. Solitude was where lawyers learned to sharpen their knives. It happened just after 3 a.m, the kind of hour when even the wind sounds guilty. I was asleep in the trailer, boots by the door, coffee pot still half full from the night before. Then came the sound. Sharp, wrong, like wood splintering, metal hitting sand. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside. The night air hit me cold and wet, thick with salt. The beam cut through the fog, and there it was. The north fence was down, rope lines slashed clean through, metal stakes bent sideways. A stack of treated lumber I'd ordered just last week was covered in red paint, thrown by the bucket, dripping like blood. Even the trailer door wasn't spared. Big block letters, sprayed in enamel. No private docks on our beach. For a long moment I just stood there, breathing through clenched teeth, listening to the hiss of the sea. It wasn't the paint that got me. Paint washes off. It was the assumption behind it, that fear would make me fold, that if they made enough noise, the law would start to look optional. I swept the flashlight toward the dunes. 2 figures, dark hoodies, one of them limping, left foot dragging in the sand. They thought the fog would hide them, but the infrared camera I'd mounted on the pine tree didn't care about fog. I watched them cross back toward the HOA path. No masks. One of them looked straight into the lens, and even from 50 yards away, I recognized that jawline. Karen. I'd seen that same smirk earlier that week, when she thought she had the county in her pocket. Now she was vandalizing private property like a teenager with a spray can and a grudge. I didn't shout, didn't chase, just raised my phone and snapped 3 photos of her silhouette against the floodlight glow. Evidence doesn't argue, it remembers. By dawn, the site looked like a crime scene, red paint splashed across the lumber pile, buckets lying open, streaks leading back toward the dunes. I poured coffee, set my camera on the table, and downloaded the footage from the night before. The video played in silence, 2 shapes slipping through the fog, the limp, the paint, the smirk, clear as confession. At 8 a.m. I called the sheriff's office. The same deputy as before answered. When he saw the footage, he whistled low. "Damn," he said. "That's your HOA president, all right." He scratched his chin, shaking his head. "Looks like vandalism and trespass, maybe property damage if you push it." "Oh, I'll push it," I said. "And while you're at it, check the county complaint log. She's been using a fake coalition to file injunctions. Same name, same P.O. box." He nodded slowly, already taking notes. When he left, I sat on the trailer steps, watching the tide roll in. The paint was still wet on the boards, glinting in the morning sun. It looked like someone had tried to bleed the color out of the world, and didn't quite finish the job. For the first time, I felt the anger settle in. Not loud or wild, but cold, precise. The kind of anger that measures its words and files paperwork. Karen thought she was playing community politics. She didn't know she'd just crossed into criminal law. I turned the camera toward the wreckage, pressed record, and spoke calmly into the lens. This isn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This is evidence. And if the county won't stop her, the courts will. Then I shut it off, poured another cup of coffee, and waited for the day to start. The gulls were already circling overhead, shrieking against the wind, like witnesses who had seen too much. By the time the deputy's report was filed, I already had a flash drive in my pocket and a plan in my head. When you've spent 20 years in the legal trenches, you don't wait for justice to find you. You go get it. I drove 3 hours east to Charleston, to a law office that used to have my name on the door. Whitaker and Lowell. The glass still bore the old lettering, faded from salt air and time. Tom Whitaker was the kind of lawyer you don't forget. Gray hair, gray suit, and a voice that could talk a banker out of his own vault. We hadn't spoken in 4 years, not since I walked away from the partnership and the paycheck. He looked up when I stepped into his office, eyebrows raised. Well, I'll be damned, if it isn't the prodigal counselor. I dropped the flash drive on his desk. Got something better than a confession. He leaned back, curious. You always did skip the pleasantries. What's this? Vandalism, bribery, fraud, and a woman who thinks she can turn local government into her personal sword. He opened the folder I'd brought, photos of the vandalism, screenshots of Karen's fake coalition, the contractor's written statement, and the audio file of the attempted bribery. His expression shifted from amusement to focus. Well, hell, he muttered, flipping through the pages. That's a full meal. Yeah, I said, and I'm done eating bologna. I tell the county, either explain this or I'll sue them for acting as agents of the HOA and demand every piece of correspondence between them. Tom chuckled, low and approving. Still got that edge. Edge never left, I said. Just stopped using it for the wrong people. He nodded slowly, then pointed at the photos. You want to go scorched earth? I shook my head. No. I want to go clean, legal, fast. She built a fake nonprofit, funneled HOA money into it, and used it to freeze my permits. That's tortious interference and fraudulent representation. Let's start there. Tom smiled like a man who'd just remembered why he liked his job. Then let's file an injunction. Hit her where it hurts. Authority. We spent the next 2 hours drafting language tight enough to hold water in a hurricane. Every claim sourced, every citation precise. The kind of motion that doesn't shout. It bleeds quiet confidence. At one point, Tom looked up from his laptop. You ever miss it? He asked. The fight? He nodded. I thought about the courtroom lights, the smell of coffee and paper, the rush of argument. I miss what it was supposed to be, I said. Not what it became. He didn't answer, just kept typing. Outside, the rain started, a slow, steady patter against the window. By sunset, we had it printed. Motion for preliminary injunction against Coastal Vista Shores Homeowners Association. Not against Karen directly. No, that would come later. This was bigger. This was cutting the head off the snake, not the tail. Grounds. Abuse of authority, fraudulent representation, obstruction of lawful property development. Relief sought. Immediate freeze of all HOA operations, expenditures, and enforcement rights pending investigation. Tom slid the pages into a folder, pressed his seal onto the corner. There, he said, a nice, sharp piece of paper. I smiled. Paper beats gossip, every time. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. You know, James, people like her, they thrive on silence. They count on decent men being too polite to fight back. I'm done being polite, I said, and I meant it. We filed the motion before the courthouse closed. When the clerk stamped it, the sound echoed through the marble hall like a gavel, clean, final, certain. On the drive home, the storm had rolled inland. The wipers beat a rhythm against the windshield, steady, relentless. Lightning flashed across the bay as I crossed the bridge back toward Beaufort County. Each flash lit up the dunes, the water, and the roof of that battered shack waiting for me. I used to think the law was a cage. Turns out, it's a hammer. You just have to remember which end to hold. The injunction landed on a Wednesday. I was sitting on the porch steps with a mug of black coffee when Tom called. She read it yet? I asked. He chuckled. Oh, she's reading it right now. Certified courier, straight to her front door. I could almost hear the smile in his voice. And she's about to realize she can't spend a single HOA dime without court approval. The morning breeze carried the smell of salt and pine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt it. Momentum. The order was clean, precise. All operations of the Coastal Vista Shores Homeowners Association are hereby suspended pending investigation. No new meetings, no citations, no spending, no power. It didn't roar like justice. It whispered, but I knew the sound well, paper cutting through arrogance. I pictured Karen opening that envelope in her perfect kitchen, maybe mid-sip of herbal tea, still believing she ran the coast. Then her eyes catching the seal. Then the realization, the kind of cold slap that doesn't fade fast. For the first time since this started, I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter, satisfaction, maybe, or balance. By noon, word spread through the county like tidewater. Contractors started calling back. The permit office finally returned my emails. Even the hardware store clerk who'd stopped saying good morning gave me a nod again. Funny how fast people remember fairness once the bullies are muzzled. Tom sent me a copy of the judge's remarks. The man hadn't minced words. He called the HOA's behavior a gross overreach of authority under the guise of environmental stewardship. That's lawyer talk for, you played yourself. I walked down to the shoreline that evening, watching the sun drop behind the dunes. The water glowed like old brass again. For the first time since I'd bought the land, I could hear the waves without the static of politics. And yet, somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen don't quit. They retreat, reload, and return uglier. I sat on the sand, sipping cold coffee from a thermos, and thought about how far I'd drifted from who I used to be. Back when I practiced law, I measured victories in dollars and deadlines. Now, I measured them in inches of reclaimed shoreline. Maybe that's what peace is supposed to feel like. Not winning, just being left alone. But peace and people like her can't share the same room for long. The next morning, a courier envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a letter from the County Environmental Department. After reviewing the evidence and communications received, we have determined there is no credible environmental threat to the site. All previous restrictions are hereby lifted. I let out a laugh I hadn't felt in months. It came from deep in the chest, like shaking off rust. I called Tom. They cleared the permit, he whistled. Just in time. You're on the right side of gravity now. What about her? He paused. She's rattled. Can't make a move without the court's permission. But don't mistake silence for surrender. I didn't. That night, the air felt too still, too calm. I walked the fence line with a flashlight, checked every camera, every post, all quiet. Too quiet. Out there, past the dunes, the pastel lights of Coastal Vista flickered faintly, like a dying pulse. And somewhere behind one of those windows, I imagined Karen pacing, thinking, plotting her next move. But for now, the tide had turned. I climbed the old dock and looked out over the dark water. A small wave slapped the pilings, gentle, steady. The sound of things returning to where they belong. I thought about how many times I'd used the law like a weapon, to win cases that never should have been fought. Now, for the first time, it felt like a shield. I whispered to the night, paper beats power, always has. And for a brief, precious moment, the coast was mine again. 3 days after the injunction, the storm broke, not in the sky, but in the paperwork. It started with a phone call from an old friend at the Coastal Waterways Commission, a man who owed me a favor from a case years ago. James, he said, you might want to see something. We've been cross-checking shoreline data after that HOA freeze hit the news. Something about your parcel doesn't line up. Those words, doesn't line up, have a special weight in my world. They're the first crack before the wall falls. He sent over a folder of scans and survey maps, the kind that smelled like old ink in government storage. Among them was a black and white coastal chart from 1961. On the left margin, near my property line, was a code I hadn't seen in decades. FAP 17, Federal Access Point. My heart did that slow, deliberate thud that only lawyers get when they realize the law is suddenly, beautifully, on their side. According to the records, the old fishing pier, the same rotten pilings I'd been measuring for replacement, wasn't just private infrastructure. It had been registered in 1943 as a federal public utility landmark under the Coastal Trust Program, intended to guarantee community access to the water during wartime supply runs, which meant that entire stretch of beach, the one Karen's HOA had fenced, monetized, and beautified, wasn't theirs to own at all. It was, by law, public land. I stared at the map for a long while. The ink was faded, but the coordinates were exact, right where my dock stood now. For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or curse. Then I remembered something my old mentor once told me. Truth doesn't vanish. It just waits for someone patient enough to dig it back up. And God help me, I had patience. I called Tom. He picked up on the second ring. Tell me you found something good, he said. Better than good, I replied. You ever heard of FAP 17? Silence. Then a whistle. You're kidding. That pier's on the registry? Was. Until someone forgot to mention it when the HOA filed their property boundary expansions. Tom let out a low laugh. Well, looks like they just built their picnic benches on Uncle Sam's porch. We spent the rest of the day gathering evidence: federal trust documents, archival photos, inspection records. By evening, we had a legal stack tall enough to make a judge sit up straight, but fate wasn't done helping. That night, an anonymous email landed in my inbox. No subject line, no message, just 4 words. "You'll want this." Attached was a PDF transcript, an internal HOA board meeting from 6 years earlier. Half the lines redacted, but the important one wasn't. Karen's voice, clear as day. "No one's going to check the federal maps. If we control access, we control the beach. Simple as that." That was it, the smoking gun. I stared at the screen until the glow of the monitor turned the room blue. 6 years of deceit, millions in fake beach maintenance fees, and the arrogance to say it out loud. I sent everything: the map, the transcript, the financials, straight to my contact at the Federal Coastal Oversight Office. He called back within the hour. "Mr. Porter," he said, his tone switching from polite to official, "I believe your HOA has been conducting business on protected federal property. We'll be sending a team for inspection." "Good," I said. "Bring cameras." Friday afternoon they arrived, black SUVs crawling down the HOA boulevard like the law-wearing boots. Agents in khakis and polo shirts with federal badges clipped to their belts spread across the sand, mapping coordinates, photographing fences, scanning QR-tagged benches. From my trailer window, I could see the ripple of panic spreading through the neighborhood, homeowners peeking from blinds, whispering. Someone dropped a martini glass, and then Karen emerged, wide-brimmed hat, perfect posture, that same air of authority she'd worn since the first day she trespassed on my land. She marched straight toward one of the inspectors, heels stabbing the sand like punctuation. "I'm the HOA president," she announced. "You need to coordinate with our legal counsel before setting foot here." The inspector didn't even look up. "Ma'am, this beach is under federal jurisdiction. We're not here to coordinate. We're here to document violations." Karen froze. The words hit her like surf against a seawall. For a second, the mask cracked. Then she turned sharply and stormed off toward her Lexus, phone already at her ear. By dusk, they'd tagged 23 violations: unauthorized construction, obstruction of public access, falsified zoning filings, and misuse of HOA funds for non-approved advocacy. The agents packed up, the light fading gold over the dunes. When the last SUV pulled away, I stepped outside. The beach was quiet again, except for the slow hiss of the tide reclaiming its own. I stood there for a long time, watching the water creep back toward the pilings, the same pilings that had been federal long before any pastel house existed. I thought about the old fisherman who built that dock in the 40s. He didn't know he was making history. He just wanted a place to work, to breathe, to live, and that was all I wanted too. The difference was, I finally had proof that history was on my side. "They didn't steal from me," I said quietly. "They stole from everyone." The wind picked up, carrying the words out over the bay. Maybe the sea heard me, maybe it didn't, but either way, it felt like the beginning of the end. They came back the next day. Not quietly this time. I was tightening a beam under the rebuilt porch when I heard engines. Deep, even, government grade. 4 black SUVs rolled down the coastal road and stopped right in front of the HOA's beach access gate. The air shifted. The sea went still. Even the gulls seemed to hush. Federal agents stepped out, badges gleaming in the sun, cameras swinging from their shoulders, boots sinking into sand that, until that moment, the HOA had called its own. I stood by the fence line, arms folded, watching. Across the dunes, homeowners peeked from their windows like birds in a storm. Some stepped outside, phones raised, whispering questions they didn't want answers to. And then I saw her. Karen Levelvelle, queen of the pastel coast, stepping out of her Lexus in wide-brimmed defiance. White linen, gold bracelets, the same sunglasses she'd worn the day she tried to shut me down. She moved fast, the way people move when they still think they can command the tide. She approached one of the inspectors, a tall man in khakis and a navy windbreaker marked FCOO. "I'm the HOA president," she declared, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You need to coordinate with our legal team immediately." The agent didn't flinch. He just adjusted his sunglasses. "Ma'am, this site is under federal protection. We're not here to coordinate. We're here to document violations." You could see it happen. The moment control slipped through her fingers. The color drained from her face, leaving only pride to hold her upright. She tried again, louder. "You have no right to—" Click. A camera flash froze her mid-sentence. The agents fanned out, tagging fences, scanning QR-coded benches, photographing her private beach signs like crime evidence. Karen turned to one of her board members, an older man clutching a clipboard. "Call the lawyer," she hissed. "Now." He didn't move, just stared at the sand. I walked closer, stopping a few yards away. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Her eyes met mine for half a heartbeat. It was all there. Rage, confusion, disbelief. She looked like someone who had spent her life talking over people, suddenly realizing no one was listening. By late afternoon, the investigation had drawn a crowd. Local news vans arrived, anchors rehearsing their lines while cameramen adjusted focus. Residents gathered behind the caution tape, murmuring. One of the agents spoke quietly into a radio. Then two federal marshals approached Karen. "Ma'am," one said evenly, "you're being placed under arrest for fraud, obstruction of justice, and falsification of property claims." Her mouth opened, half protest, half gasp. "This is harassment. This is my beach." The marshal shook his head. "No, ma'am. It's everybody's beach." They took her by the arms, firm but professional. Her sunglasses fell into the sand, and for the first time she didn't bend to pick them up. As they led her away, she twisted back toward me, shouting something I couldn't quite hear over the wind. Maybe a curse, maybe a plea. Didn't matter. The surf drowned it out. The reporters swarmed, microphones raised, flashes going off like lightning. Somewhere behind me, someone started clapping, then another. A small, uncertain ripple of sound that grew into something steady. Not applause for me, but for relief. The HOA empire was crumbling in real time, one headline at a time. The agents loaded boxes of seized documents into the SUVs. Meeting minutes, financial ledgers, false filings. Every secret dragged out into daylight. I stood at the edge of the pier, the wind whipping through my shirt, and watched the whole thing unfold. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. There was no victory dance in this kind of justice, just the quiet click of balance returning to place. As the last SUV door shut, one of the marshals walked over. "You the complainant?" he asked. "Something like that." He nodded, offered a small smile. "Hell of a paper trail, sir. Most folks just rant on Facebook." "Old habits," I said. He chuckled, climbed into his vehicle, and drove off with the convoy. By sunset, the beach was empty again, except for the footprints, the wind, and me. The last light of day turned the wet sand bronze. The tide rolled in, soft and forgiving. I sat on the edge of the dock and let the salt air fill my lungs. Didn't feel like triumph. Felt like peace finally earned the hard way, the kind that doesn't come from winning, but from outlasting. Behind me, the pastel houses glowed faintly under the setting sun, quiet now, humbled. I took one last sip of coffee gone cold and whispered to the sea, "That's enough talking, Karen. The water's got the floor now." The courthouse smelled like old wood and rain. I'd spent half my life in rooms like this, arguing, defending, parsing truth until it fit in someone's pocket. But this time, I wasn't behind the table. I was in the second row, just watching. Karen Levelville sat at the defense table, pale under the fluorescent lights. No sunglasses, no wide-brimmed hat, just a woman who'd finally run out of fences to hide behind. The trial drew a crowd. Reporters lined the back wall, whispering between notes. Residents from the HOA filled the benches, faces pinched with anger, embarrassment, or maybe guilt. Some of them had cheered her once. Now they couldn't look her in the eye. The prosecutor stood, a young woman with the kind of confidence I used to have before life taught me patience. She laid out the evidence like a surgeon, the fake nonprofit filings, the falsified maps, the bank transfers that funneled $1.4 million of maintenance fees into personal accounts and political donations. Then came the recordings, my footage, the bribery calls, and the vandalism video from the night of the red paint. The room stayed silent except for the hum of the projector. When Karen's voice filled the speakers, "If we control access, we control the beach." I saw the jurors shift in their seats. That was the moment it turned. You could feel it. Her attorney tried to spin it. Miscommunication, passionate advocacy, good intentions gone too far. But passion doesn't buy silence with envelopes of cash. Halfway through the second day, one of the HOA board members, the treasurer, broke. He admitted under oath that they'd known about the federal boundary for years, that they'd buried it because, in his words, nobody ever checks the old maps. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a stare sharp enough to sand wood, didn't hide his disgust. He called their actions a systematic abuse of community trust and government process. When the verdict came down, it was clean, swift, and heavy. Guilty on all counts, 8 years in prison, no parole for 4, full restitution to the HOA members, to be paid from her frozen assets, including a vacation home in Hilton Head she'd conveniently forgotten to disclose. The 2 board members beside her received lesser sentences: probation, fines, permanent bans from any nonprofit or HOA leadership for life. But the real sentence came after the gavel. The judge leaned forward and said, "The Coastal Vista Shores HOA is hereby dissolved and placed under federal receivership." You could hear it, that quiet collective exhale, not joy, not applause, just relief. The crowd thinned after that. Some residents lingered, dazed, as if waking from a bad dream they'd paid dues to. One elderly couple cried softly. They'd been pressured into paying thousands for shoreline erosion projects that never existed. When Karen was let out in handcuffs, she kept her chin up, lips tight, but when the door closed behind her, her shoulders dropped. The kind of fall you can't fake. I stayed seated long after the room emptied. The wood creaked under me. For years I'd thought justice was a kind of math. Argument plus evidence equals truth. Now I knew better. Justice is gravity. Everything eventually falls where it belongs. Outside, the sky had cleared. The courthouse steps were slick from morning rain, reflecting the light like silver glass. Reporters clustered near the curb, shouting questions. "Mr. Porter, any comment?" I just said, "Let the record speak," because it already had. By nightfall, news stations across the state were running the headline, "HOA president convicted in federal beach fraud." The footage showed her walking across the sand in handcuffs. The same beach she'd once claimed was private. The next morning, someone tore down the HOA welcome sign. By noon, it was gone. Just an empty post and a fluttering piece of tape. For the first time since I bought that land, the shoreline looked the way it should. Open, quiet, honest. I walked the path to the pier and watched the tide come in. The wind smelled like cedar and salt, and for once, I didn't feel like a lawyer, or a victim, or a winner, just a man standing on ground he'd earned, listening to water that didn't belong to anyone. It took one long, humid summer to rebuild the cabin. By July, the air was thick with sawdust, diesel, and redemption. We stripped the place to its bones. Every rotten plank came out, every bent nail replaced. I used reclaimed cypress from a shipyard upriver, strong wood, the kind that remembers storms and stays standing anyway. The new porch went up first, wide enough for a rocking chair and a coffee cup. Then came the roof, tin, because I liked the sound of rain too much to muffle it. By August, the walls were sealed, the dock rebuilt exactly where the old one had stood, and every nail I drove into that wood felt like a quiet act of defiance. The first time I stepped onto the finished pier, barefoot, morning light spilling across the water, I just stood there and listened. No more engines, no orders, no HOA noise. Just the sea, the way it used to sound before people tried to own it. One afternoon, a boy from the neighborhood rode his bike down the trail and stopped near the gate. "Hey, mister," he called, "is this place open?" "Open?" I asked. He nodded toward the dock. "Can we go out there? My grandpa said it used to be public." I smiled. Your grandpa was right. He and 2 of his friends walked the pier, laughing, skipping stones, doing what kids are supposed to do by the water. When they left, I didn't stop them. I just carved a small sign from a piece of driftwood and hung it on the railing. People's Pier, established 1943, reclaimed 25. The neighbors noticed, not the angry kind, but the quiet ones. The people who had lived under that HOA for years, too afraid to speak up. One by one, they started coming by. Some brought coffee, others, questions. A few brought apologies. One woman, Linda from Lot 3, handed me a pie and said, "I used to believe her. I thought you were some developer trying to ruin the view." I told her I understood. She smiled. "Well, I'm glad you didn't leave." Neither was I. By September, the county crews had removed every trace of the old HOA signs. The board's website went dark. The houses looked the same, but the air felt different, lighter, like the place could finally breathe again. The Charleston Observer ran a piece titled, "The Man Who Took Back the Beach." I hated the headline. I didn't take it back. It was never mine to begin with. I just reminded everyone whose it really was. A week later, the National Park Service called. They offered to buy part of the lot, to include it in a new historical shoreline corridor, with plaques, interpretive signs, maybe even a walking tour. I thanked them kindly and said no. I didn't fix this place for profit, I said. I did it to breathe again. Somehow, that line ended up in print. Linda told me it made her cry. I told her it made me roll my eyes. But truth be told, it wasn't wrong. We held a small cookout the weekend after the last of the federal signs came down. Locals brought folding chairs, coolers, and stories. A bluegrass trio showed up uninvited and started playing. By sunset, the whole bay glowed copper, and for the first time in a long time, people weren't talking about lawsuits or fences, just weather, fish, and the kind of things that make a town feel alive again. Even the guy who once called me a dock-hugging squatter online showed up with his dog and a bag of charcoal. He didn't say sorry, he didn't need to. As night fell, the tide came in slow, brushing the posts of the new pier. Lanterns swayed in the breeze. Someone laughed. Someone else sang off-key. And I realized something I hadn't felt since the day I quit law. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of truth. For years, I'd thought the law was just a business, a machine built to twist words and bury good people. But standing there, surrounded by neighbors, under the same stars my grandfather once fished beneath, I understood. The law itself was never the problem. It's the hands that hold it that decide whether it heals or hurts. I used to wield it like a weapon. Now, for the first time, I'd used it as a shield. And maybe that's what I was meant to find here all along. Not a place to escape, but a reason to believe again. The night ended the way all good nights should, with firelight flickering on smiling faces and the sound of water slapping softly against wood. When everyone left, I sat on the end of the pier, bare feet dangling above the tide. The stars shimmered on the bay like old silver coins. A faint wind carried the scent of cedar and salt. I took one deep breath, let it out slow, and said to no one in particular, I came here to disappear. Instead, I remembered why it matters. The waves rolled in, steady, sure, forgiving, and the world was quiet again.